Come on, man. What's wrong with you? What kind of crazy podcast are you listening to late at night to have you convinced that the government's coming after you, your local church, or evangelical institution? Come on, get over it. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today, what I want to do is I want to look at the effects of the Equality Act upon veterans' benefits in local evangelical institutions. However, before we do, I just want to look at that phrase. How many of you have experienced someone saying that to you, especially over the last year? People are going to say, what is wrong with you? Do you really think that the government's going to come after you, your local church, or your evangelical institutions? In many ways, what people are trying to do is they're trying to almost shame you into thinking that that could never happen, that you are the one who's been, affected by this. You're somehow being gaslit by these right-wing conservatives, when the reality is that if you just simply look out at society and you see the things that are going on, you find that throughout history, there has been this battle between the city of God and the city of man. And each era, we run into that. And in our era, we find the same thing happening. In many respects, the city of man is always trying to trump the city of God. Now, we as Christians, we have hope. We've read the end of the book. We know that the city of God ultimately wins. But now, on this side of Christ's return, we're called to be the church militant. We're called to defend the gospel once for all given to the saints. And here's the reality of it. We don't always get to pick the battles that we face, nor do we get to pick the era in which we serve. So this age in which we live and these battles in which we face are something that God has called us to. Now, one thing I want us to think about is evangelicals, maybe in the previous century, were very good at fighting their particular battles. And let's think of some of those battles. They fought the battle for the Bible. They fought issues on creation and evolution, because in many respects, higher criticism or even the hard sciences were the real battles that Christians were facing during that age. But things are different now. Now the city of man is not coming at us with the hard sciences. Rather, they're coming at us with a lawyer in one hand and the social sciences in the other. And by that I mean there are legislations taking place in our country in order to enact social policy. All of these psychology programs or social programs coming from different universities or diversity officers or different ideas of inclusion, equity, and so forth are starting to affect the evangelical church. Now, if anybody has really kept an eye on how the evangelical church has responded to it, there have been a variety of responses. Some have rejected these, which I think is the faithful biblical approach. We don't try to find some middle ground on biblical ethical issues. Others have completely embraced them. They've completely bought into all of the new ethic. And in many ways, we would probably not call them evangelicals or Christians if they're buying into such things. But the thing that concerns me the most are those in the middle, those who are trying to, in many ways, have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to embrace the new ethic and yet remain evangelical. And we could have a variety of ways of explaining this. We could call them Mr. Middleman, which is my favorite way of looking at it. They're trying to say, well, I don't want to be on either extreme. I'm just going to find the holy, righteous middle ground on this. Another way could be third way politics, in which we start to navigate the scene, we look at the landscape, and we just try to go with the ebb and flow. But what we find is that the Bible doesn't present Mr. Middleman. That's called compromise. And third way ethics are giving over to really the pagan ethic of our society. So what we as Christians are called to do is stand forth and firm upon biblical truth in an age that's opposed to the concept of truth. We are to be lights in a dark era. Now, we know all of these things, but I want to give you a few examples of this so that you can see what it might look like to stand forth for the gospel in our age. And in order to do so, I want us to look at this notion of the Equality Act, and I want to encourage all of you to give and give generously to Southern Evangelical Seminary on Giving Tuesday as they are pushing back against the Equality Act and trying to defend the rights of veterans and the benefits due to them because of their service to this country. So let's look at this. We know what the Equality Act is. We've seen it. Whether you're a school teacher or a businessman, whether you just turn on the news or you listen to the radio, you see that there's this movement in society, and it comes with a variety of different terms. It might be the LGBTQ. It might be the social justice. It might be this idea of, well, love is love. We know all the different mottos and mantras that they try to put down before us and try to get you to accept. But what I want us to look at is the real effects of the Equality Act, in particular where the rubber meets the road, or as we could say, how it's actually going to affect you, your family, your local church, and your evangelical institution. And why that's important is that God has given us the family really as a means by which he is reaching the individuals. It's where we see God's sphere of authority in the home, but he's also given us the local church. And if we're to preserve these institutions God has given to us, we have to be faithful to stand upon biblical truth. So here are some of the effects. So as you're probably aware, the Equality Act has affected the hiring practices of schools as the government is trying to enforce legislation in total opposition to Scripture and evangelical doctrinal statements. So let me explain that to you. What they're trying to do is say, you need to hire who we tell you to hire. And you can't go upon your old hiring practices, whether you base them upon the Bible or your doctrinal statements or some kind of religious tradition or dogma. Whatever you're trying to base it upon, you need to embrace the new ethic. And if you don't embrace our new ethic, we're going to punish you for it. And the way this starts to function is that if you're not hiring somebody that's LGBTQ, you're going to be affected by it. Or if you don't start a diversity program, you will be punished for it. And you think, well, how are they going to punish us? Well, they punish you in a variety of ways. You get tried before the court of public appeal, which is what we've seen happen on all of our news outlets. But in particular, probably the way they're going to reach evangelical institutions is through your finances and your accreditation. So let me give you a few examples of this. Let me give you a legal illustration of how this is looked upon by people today. What it's done is the whole Equality Act is it's made things like homosexuality or the LGBTQ plus program on par with Brown versus Board of Education. Now, all of us are aware of Brown versus Board of Education. This was the whole issue of how do we integrate schools during the civil rights era. In particular, how do we get black and white children into the same schools and quit segregating against people due to their skin color? Now, as evangelical Christians, we realize that it is a sin in all places and at all times to discriminate upon somebody just simply based upon their race. I don't know any evangelical Bible-believing person alive today who would say that it's right to be, racially profiling somebody or discriminating against them solely upon the ways that they were here. But that's not what's going on with this here. What's going on today is they're trying to make race and all of these different sexual orientations on par with one another. So just as you would have been punished by the federal government for not coming on with Brown versus Board of Education, well, now today, homosexuality or being LGBTQ in all those different respects, they're trying to make on par with it. So that as you tried to discriminate against the African American a half a century ago, well, now you're discriminating against these figures. You're not hiring them. You're using your evangelical ethics to do away with them. That's part of what they're trying to do with it. Another aspect is this. There are financial illustrations of what's going on with it. The Equality Act has caused conservative organizations to either compromise their ethics and affirm the new ethic, or refuse to compromise biblical ethics and they lose their funding. Think about this. If you go along with the Equality Act and you compromise your biblical ethic, you will continue to receive your funding. You will continue to have your scholarship programs, your veterans benefits, and all of the goodies that the government is going to provide you. But if you refuse to come on board with this, if you refuse to join the bandwagon of social justice and LGBTQ, you will be punished. In particular, they are going to take your funding away. And what we're going to look at today is is the result of this, as a result, if the Biden administration persists in this effort and they are successful in trying to force us, which is evangelicals, into hiring people who do not adhere unto our Christian worldview, we will be forced into a position of not being able to receive these benefits on behalf of veterans who have worked so hard to obtain them. So let me give you an example. You have a person who at, say, 17 years old, when they're in high school, they sign up for the Army or the Marines. And while signing up, they were told, you will serve your country, and upon your retirement or upon you leaving as a person with good standing before the United States military, certain funds will be given to you, and you'll be able to go to any of these institutions that are approved by us, which usually meant just an accredited institution. Well, today things have changed. To be an approved institution doesn't just mean that you have accreditation and that you can benefit that individual who will then benefit society. Rather, you got to buy into the new social ethic. You have to buy into the Equality Act. And as it says here, if they're actually successful in this, it's going to require Christian schools to hire people who are not Christians. It's going to require Christian schools to hire people who do not affirm biblical ethics. So when you see evangelical institutions compromising on this, in many ways, they're doing it for financial gain. So what is this going to specifically do? How is this going to specifically affect people? Well, it's going to affect three different types of people in particular. First of all, it's going to affect veterans seeking education at Christian schools, in particular, convictional Christian schools. Second, it's going to affect chaplains being trained at evangelical seminaries. Historically, evangelicals have been opposed to these things. So now, if you want to be a person serving your country as a chaplain, and you are going to receive funds for your training, your graduate school, seminary, education training, and you want to serve our country, they're going to say, you can't go here, you can't go there. Why? They're no longer an approved school. They're no longer somebody who buys into the new social ethic. A third area that it's going to affect people is beneficiaries of disabled military veterans from receiving benefits. So let me give you an example of that. My father served in Vietnam, and he lost his leg in Vietnam. And upon returning, he was considered a disabled military veteran. And one of the things that he was able to receive was veterans benefits. And they said he could either use them or he could allocate them to his children. Well, by God's grace and providence, my father gave those benefits to me. And I attended Southern Evangelical Seminary as a student receiving those kinds of benefits. Now, here's the reality of it, is that I probably would not have been able to attend Southern Evangelical Seminary without those benefits. I didn't come from a rich family, and it's not even that SES has expensive tuition in comparison to all of these things. But the reality is that school requires funding. And students need money to attend school. And benefits like these help people who are veterans, people that are going to become chaplains, or individuals just like myself. And it's by God's grace that these things have been available so that some of us can attend these different types of institutions. Now let's keep going. Here are some thoughts to consider. First of all, in order for a school to receive veterans benefits, the institution must comply with the new government regulations. Seems very clear. It's very straightforward. If you want the funds, you have to live up to our rules. Straightforward. However, to comply with the government regulations would require an institution to hire, promote, and endorse LGBTQ, diversity programs, social justice, etc., etc., etc. But what if you can't endorse those things? What if those things are coming up against your conscience because they come up against the Word of God? Well, here's the situation that we find ourselves in. How many evangelical institutions have compromised their ethics to keep receiving these types of funds? You ever asked yourself that? How many evangelical institutions are willing to compromise on the LGBTQ plus diversity, inclusion, equity ideas? They're going to buy into the new social ethic simply because they receive funding for it. And if they were to lose that kind of funding, it would affect paychecks and it would affect the reality of the institution and its financial security. But they do it. They compromise. Why? Because we got to pay our bills, right? Well, let's keep going here. How many evangelical institutions have not notified their constituents of these types of policy changes? You ever thought about it? How many large evangelical schools have just continued to go along to get along because they know if they notified their constituents, they may lose money in a different way? Let me give you an example. Let's say you have given money for years to an evangelical school, but yet they compromise their ethic. They compromise this biblical ethic in relation to these issues. Would you still want to give to them? No. And they're aware of that. They're very much aware of the fact that in a grassroots society in which people committed to the Bible who have upheld these institutions, in many ways, the widow giving her mite for the glory of God and the furtherance of the gospel, she would withhold her funds if they found out this school was buying into new discrimination or new sexual ethics and all the rest. So what do? They change their policies to keep Uncle Sam happy, but they don't let their constituents know about it because they realize they could equally lose funds from the person in the pew. Do we ever think about that? What kind of institution should you attend? So here's what I want us to look at in addition. Are you really surprised dozens of so-called evangelical institutions have created kingdom diversity programs, affirmative action programs, or are calling for us to embrace softer forms of the LGBTQ programs? I'm not. I think it's the spirit of the age. They know the consequences of coming up against the Equality Act. And what they're trying to do is play Mr. Middleman. They're trying to have third way approaches. They're trying to get Uncle Sam's funds and yours too. In short, follow the money. Look at what they're doing. We see what's going on. Now, we understand this. We see the effects of the Equality Act and how it can really, in many ways, affect our local evangelical institutions. So here's where I want to shift things and I want to change things. I want to tell you about an institution that hasn't compromised, one that is not afraid to give Uncle Sam's dollars back to Uncle Sam, but they're also going to need your help. They're going to need the people of God to defend the city of God against the city of man. And that institution is Southern Evangelical Seminary. Now, here's what I want you to know. I'm a 2-time graduate of Southern Evangelical Seminary. I did my undergraduate there and a master's degree. I served as student body president my final year, and I'm wholly committed to the mission and focus of that institution. Now, what we have to find is that Southern Evangelical Seminary was co-founded by 2 individuals, the famous apologist, Dr. Norman Geisler, who died in 2019, and the famous evangelist, Ross Rhodes. And they sought to create an institution that would evangelize the lost and defend the historic Christian faith. And that's exactly what we need. Defending the historic Christian faith in this age requires that we stand up to things like the LGBTQ plus programs. It requires that we draw a line in the sand, that we defend the battles that are before us, like this one. But we're also called to evangelize those who are coming against us. The gospel is for those who are coming against this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. We're to evangelize these people, but also defend the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's why Southern Evangelical Seminary exists. But here's the reality. Southern Evangelical Seminary, or SES, has had a long-standing policy to not accept any federal monies that come with strings attached to it, which we believe are not in keeping with our Christian principles. And SES is experiencing significant gains in our student body. This wonderful increase, just listen to me here, is because we are remaining steadfast in our stand against the culturally popular but biblically wrong ideas in the public square. So this is what we have to see. SES has never wanted to have these strings attached from all of these government programs, your FAFSA programs, or all these different programs that are going to be scholarship programs or different ways of giving money to either the institution or that particular individual. But they're also seeing a significant increase in their enrollment. People realize that they're a biblical institution committed to biblical orthodoxy. But here's the reality of what they're facing. Even if they are not allowed, these veterans, to apply their hard-earned VA benefits towards their education at SES. Why? Because they're not going to go along with it. They're not going to compromise on these. SES is committed to ensuring the cost of education for veterans will remain the same as if they were still receiving the benefits. So let me just be very clear with you. What's going on is that the Biden administration, through the Equality Act, is trying to say that schools like SES is no longer able to receive veterans benefits. Now notice, that's a benefit that goes to the individual because they have earned it. It's not like a larger government program. But now the government is starting to step in and say, SES, you might not be a valid institution. We want to take these things away from you. And SES says, fine, we will raise more money by you taking these from our students than we could ever get from you in the first place. And that's where you come in. That's why on Giving Tuesday, what they're committed to doing is to raising funds for these veterans and for these chaplains and for these beneficiaries who should be able to receive all of these funds, but because SES won't compromise and they are students committed to attending an institution that won't compromise, they're no longer able to receive them. So SES, like we said, has a long-standing policy of saying no to government money with strings attached. And a special group of ministry partners has pledged to match dollar for dollar up to $15,000 for gifts received for Giving Tuesday. So think about this. Your gift up to $15,000 can be matched. So your $1 turns into $2. Your $10 turns into $20 in order to support people who are trying to attend Southern Evangelical Seminary. So here's what I want you to look at. SES has decided to make veterans and the fight for truth and against cancel culture the focus of Giving Tuesday this year. 100% of the money raised between now and Giving Tuesday will go towards scholarships for veteran students at SES and for the fight for truth. It will directly support the education of hardworking veterans who desire to train at SES in order to minister to a hurting world. And third, keep this in mind, it will keep SES strong as we stay steadfast to biblical truth in a darkening culture. If that's something that inspires you and something that you want to stand upon, I would encourage you to give to SES. And let me give you a few more reasons. Why SES? Why not some other institution? Well, first of all, situations do not determine our convictions. Rather, they reveal our convictions. SES is a school that's in this situation like all of these other institutions. But when you look at these other institutions and they're still receiving the funds, what does it let you know? They're compromising. That's why I say situations don't determine our convictions. Rather, they reveal them. In a hard time and in a hard place, your real ethic comes out. And that's what SES is facing. Their real ethic, their real commitment to standing forth upon biblical truth is being revealed. We know it, and they're not willing to compromise. But also, SES is a school committed to biblical convictions. Convictions in an age where people don't hold convictions, except the conviction of being against those with real convictions. But here are some of SES's convictions, their core commitments. They're committed to true truth in a post-truth age. And we know where that idea comes from. It's Francis Schaeffer's idea that we need to have true truth, not some existential truth or personal truth, but truth as that which corresponds to reality. They're also committed to classical apologetics, defending the idea of objective truth, the arguments for the existence of God, the historicity of the Bible. They're also committed to classical theism, the classical attributes of God, that God is eternal, He's immutable, He's infinite, and so forth. But here's the big one. They're committed to biblical ethics, which, as I said, is probably one of the most difficult commitments to remain steadfast unto this day. but they're also committed to the local church because they're committed to serving people who are members in the local church and the pastors that serve that local church. They're committed to training pastors, teaching teachers, and raising up evangelists to reach this world for the gospel of Jesus Christ. So here's what I want you to look at. There are a lot of people today that are going to say, why don't we just compromise? Why don't we just come together and get along, or we're never going to move forward? Well, this was something that was put forth several years ago. In fact, it was put forth in the Southern Baptist Convention as a way of trying to reconcile the moderates and the conservatives. And in order to push back against this, I want us to play this little clip, sort of as a reminder, something to inspire us, by Adrian Rogers on the real effects of compromise. So let's listen in to this quick video by Adrian before we close this up for the day.
One man said to me in that peace committee, he said, Adrian, if you don't compromise, we'll never get together. And I said to that dear friend, we don't have to get together. The Southern Baptist Convention doesn't have to survive. I don't have to be the pastor of Bellevue. I don't have to live. But I'm not going to compromise the Word of God.
So if that is something that inspires you, something that you want to be committed to, standing forth upon biblical convictions, I would encourage you to give to SES. And you may be asking how. Like I said, they have set a goal of $30,000 with a matching gift. That's what they want. So if you give $15,000, somebody else is going to match with $15,000. But I want to see this go above $30,000. I want to encourage people to give generously to this. And what you need to do is you need to contact Southern Evangelical Seminary, or you can go to their website here, ses.edu/alumni-friends/give. I will put a link down below so that you can follow it. But remember, we are trying to honor veterans as we are canceling cancel culture. So please remember to give on Giving Tuesday to Southern Evangelical Seminary.